So I want to welcome everyone again to this webinar discussing the planning steps for bus electrification, focusing on contracting and procurement. In the next hour, we'll first begin with an opening presentation framing the topic based on ITDP report From Santiago to Shenzhen, followed by interesting insights and lessons learned from the processes of implementing electric bus fleets from 2 cities in Latin America, Rio de Janeiro and Mexico City. So first, I would like to introduce to you Stanford Turner, who is a transport manager at ITDP Global. Stan is the main author of the From Santiago to Shenzhen report. He will start the formal presentations and also moderate today's discussion. Next, we'll welcome Simon Costa Rodriguez da Silva, who is the Chief of Sustainable Urban Mobility Fund for the city of Rio de Janeiro. She will share the experience of Rio municipality around the bidding process and the business models. And lastly, we'll hear from Marcel Gomez Pesina, who is the electromobility leader at Metrobus, Mexico City. He will talk about the steps that Metrobus took to plan the pilot phase, including route selection and fleet replacement. So with that, I'll hand it off to Stan to start us off.
Thanks, Ivona. Share my screen here. And can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining from. I'm very excited to be here and again, really to kind of dive into this topic that we spent quite a bit of time working on and preparing for. So I want to kind of just jump into it because I think folks are going to be very excited to hear from our panelists from the city of Rio and Metrobus. So just to want to set the stage a little briefly, and as we know, many cities are committed to reducing emissions and the resource consumption in the coming years due to climate change. And one of the biggest ways that they've decided to kind of attempt this is to focus on electrification. So in order to achieve these goals, cities need to kind of focus on electrifying buses in order to accomplish this climate task for this decade and the decades beyond. And as that technology continues to scale and become more affordable, battery electric buses, and I'm going to use the acronym BEVs occasionally in this discussion, have risen to the top as an option and provide a timely solution for cities looking to reduce their environmental impact. By electrifying fleets, cities improve their air quality, they decrease noise pollution, they reduce resource usage, excuse me, they lower greenhouse gas emissions and reduce human-induced climate change, all while improving bus service and operations. So why electric buses and why now? Well, battery electric buses represent a growing segment of the electrical vehicle market. And this is due to a number of factors. Longer distance ranges as battery technology is improving for practices in driving and charging and the maintenance. Falling purchase costs as the industries achieve economies of scale. More informed decision making and understanding of how these battery electric buses work within cities and by conducting pilots and gathering more data from different geographical perspectives. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is more financing options through supportive grants and innovative financing schemes. So with that, I want to, as more cities, I guess, have begun to adopt this, what we wanted to kind of focus on is what should be considered. Our publication From Santiago to Shenzhen, How Electric Buses Are Moving in the City, was actually developed by the ITDP Global Research and Impact Team to examine and chronicle the state of knowledge of battery electric buses, the existing opportunities and considerations, the best practices, and to identify the current policy and implementation gaps. And so for this, we examined and studied nearly 200 documents, most of the latest literature, including academic reports and relevant gray literature related to battery electric buses, public fleet electrification, electricity through the production, infrastructure, and grids. And in addition, this paper draws on real information about pilots and fleets that include, but are not limited to, projects from our regional offices. And that direct expertise helps kind of gather and kind of coalesce and aggregate these engagements at the various stages of battery electric bus implementation. So the publication is pretty comprehensive and it tackles a number of themes from like the existing technology, charging infrastructure, pilots, contracts, financing and funding, operations, maintenance, and finally supportive strategies to tie in the best practices to date and really incorporate those lessons learned from our regional offices and other global examples. And we believe that this framework presented is going to really help cities in the decision-making process as they implement electric buses in their existing fleet. So today, we will be focusing on the contract section, but please stay tuned for the second part of this webinar series, where we will discuss in more detail some of these other themes. So before jumping into the actual contracting process, I think it's important to note that battery electric bus planning as a whole is an iterative process that involves contracting and financing, which are tied together, and identifying possible charging systems, buses, battery types, corresponding hardware, software, maintenance, operation, the list goes on. This chart on this slide actually highlights some of the complexity and the steps involved. And so while electric bus contracts share similarities with the traditional public bus contracts, there will be actually new stakeholders in contract areas in which are quite different and innovative that need to be considered from both the ownership and operations standpoints. And also just to note, given the high cost of battery electric buses now, procurement of these buses may be the responsibility of a number of different stakeholders, including the operators, the government, maybe even a utility company. Additional stakeholders may include also the manufacturers and vendors or third-party financiers, and that could also be split between the buses themselves and the battery. So the procurement of charging infrastructure is also similar and may involve stakeholders not necessarily just responsible for the buses themselves. And so I think this is something we wanted to stress, is that it will require a willingness by all stakeholders to collaborate and determine the financing schemes that are possible, which will in turn actually affect the contract structure. So for example, operators should communicate with utilities very early in the planning process, as the feasibility for different charging schemes will really depend on the utility company's willingness to collaborate, as well as the capacity of the electric grid and the extent to pricing. So contracts have typically or traditionally have been structured to combine asset procurement and operations. And this includes the financial costs such as debt payments, and they're often tied to the time it takes to get the return of investment for these assets. So some examples of the most common types of contracts are service contracts, which involve the operator being paid to operate a minimum number of kilometers or miles of public transport services within the municipality, and the municipality directs and owns the revenue from this type of contract. Area contracts, which are similar, but the municipality actually pays the operator to provide service on a set area. And depending on the type of contract, that can be a gross or net contract, and the municipality or the owner or the operator of that service owns the fair revenue. So these are just kind of important things to remember. The net and gross cost contracting is something I think we'll kind of jump back into later. Route contracts, operators have licenses within the municipality to operate on particular routes or lines. And again, depending on that contract type, if it's gross or net, the contractor or the municipality may own the fair revenue. Another one is the design, build, operate, or DBOs, and they are a concession that are provided to the municipality for the contractor to design, build, and operate the public transportation system. The contractor traditionally owns the revenue for this. And then the last one is profit sharing, and this is where the operator is paid a kind of a predetermined percentage of total revenue to operate this service. So while electric buses will share similarities with these contracting types, there will be new stakeholders, as I mentioned, in contract areas such as charging, operations, and maintenance to consider when implementing electric buses from both the ownership and the operation standpoint. And one of the kind of notable examples of this is actually this integration is with the country of India, in which gross cost contracts were made mandatory for the cities in order to receive the subsidies for the FAME 2 scheme. And actually, this resulted in a major shift in bus contracting more largely, and really, again, moved the sector, the e-bus sector in India, to more a gross cost contracting scheme. So in this report, we've actually evaluated different approaches cities have taken to kind of contracting e-buses, and we came away with a number of takeaways for consideration. We think starting out, contracts should promote zero emissions goals through incentivizing the adoption of improved technology, and specifically new technologies that reduce environmental emissions and increase community health, which is what battery electric buses do. While existing long-term contracts may prevent adoption if it's too rigid, long-term contracts with the appropriate flexibility and incentives for adopting these new zero emission technologies can really help spread the cost over a longer period of time. We found out by establishing vehicle ownership contracts that are longer for electric buses, for example, such as up to 15 years, the financial benefits of the electric bus with their total cost of ownership is over a full lifetime, vehicle lifetime, which ideally is 12 years or longer. So cities really should consider establishing shorter contracts for non-zero emission buses, ICE buses, and such as, I think these are typically up to 10 years, but we would discourage this because this kind of continues to add to the idea that this is not really improving or attempting to hit those climate goals that cities are trying to kind of reach. So the shorter that you can kind of issue these longer or these shorter contracts for these non-zero emission buses, the better it is for the city. For e-bus performance and protection, I think it should be very clear that contracts that with vendors that underperform may result in the return of the vehicles and not penalize the public transportation agency. This is something that has kind of afflicted many of the early e-bus adoptions. And so one of the things that we think within the contracting process is the focus on performance and battery life must be tied to the cost and life cycle guarantees. And contracts really should allow transportation agencies to kind of hold the manufacturers accountable while giving them the flexibility to change the buses or battery models according to the performance and necessarily the geographic or the context of that particular transport agency and service needed. So an inconsistent rate of battery life degradation can significantly impact the number of years a battery can be used, as well as the battery range's performance. And we really feel like contracts should tie to the vendors to the promise of the battery life in order to receive vendor payment. And this kind of ensures that the observed performance does meet the criterias and lifespan is met when it's promised, as promised within that contract. And so also the last piece of this is to be able to track this underperformance. Operators need to be able to collect this data. Cities really should consider when they're implementing electric buses, which with making sure that they have data metrics that they want to collect and outline within these contracts. This is that place that you can kind of really establish these kind of relationships. And in addition, it's important for that this data is something that can be shared more largely, and it can be included with other stakeholders so that they can plan around the current system as well as future needs for that transportation operations. One of the most important parts of this is the environmental goals. Contracts really should align with existing international and national environmental legislation to really ground the pilots and then the fleet implementation into the urban environments of that specific context. Operators should be monitoring the vehicle emissions on a regular basis and really inspect whether those targets and standards are actually being met in terms of pollutant emissions and making sure that they're again held to that standard while the contract is underway. They should also establish maybe particularly fines or penalties linked to these kind of environmental needs or requirements, and this will help improve the quality of service during this contract period, as well as obviously the environmental impacts that the city is attempting to accomplish. And then for e-bus infrastructure, contracts should really state that charging infrastructure must be interoperable with multiple bus manufacturers to really ensure that not just one bus manufacturer has a monopoly on that system. Battery electric buses can be particularly sensitive, and the ability to be able to switch out potentially different manufacturers or different bus operators is going to be a necessary piece depending on the geographical region or the weather conditions or anything that was required by the local context. So contracts should really ensure that depots are properly covered as well and ventilated in order to enable the best operational performance for battery electric buses. And then lastly, and I think one of the kind of crucial pieces of this is actually the making sure that the care and the battery life of these buses is met through this negotiation. So while driving styles of e-buses may shift dramatically, the battery performance of these buses is critical. And in order to kind of make sure that they're running and operating at peak, the drivers need to understand how they work and need to be trained on what that actually looks like. So one of the things that we would recommend cities to do is really make sure you include mandatory trainings for the employees on e-bus operations, as well as implement maintenance incentives to ensure that there's timely repair and maintenance around these e-buses as you implement them within your fleet. So that's kind of the broader context of what we found in terms of the takeaways around this contracting process. And with that, I know that was kind of a very brief overview, but if you are very much interested in learning more, you can find the actual e-bus paper and report on ITDP's publication page. We're actually translating the full report into Portuguese, and you can expect that to be released fairly soon from the ITDP Brazil office, along with some other electrification resources. And in addition, we've actually developed an executive summary report that provides an overview of the findings, as well as kind of key recommendations, that is available now in English and Spanish, and with a Portuguese translation coming soon. So I appreciate you all listening, and I want to turn this over to our panelists. So I'm going to lead off with Simone from the City of Rio, who will provide more context on the opportunities and considerations for contracting and procuring electric buses within the City of Rio. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Simone. I'm going to share my presentation. Is it okay?
It's loading right now. Yes, it's great.
So my name is Simone Costa. I'm from the city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I'm going to present some challenges that we are facing contracting and procuring e-buses. So here we're going to focus on this contracting and procuring. We are going to talk about the main challenge that we are facing, the commitments of the city. So how we plan for e-buses, how the lessons, limitations, and setbacks that we have, and the next steps we learn from this experience. First of all, it's important that we see, we have the context of the city. We are 6.7 million city inhabitants. In the metropolitan region are about 11. The modal split of the city is 27% towards public transport. In the last data, the data pre-pandemic, we have 2.8 million passengers per day, an average distance 43 million kilometers per month. The number of urban routes, we have conventional lines that we call SPPO, and we have 566 conventional lines, and we have 3 BRT corridors and 26 services. And also we have 350,000 passengers in BRT per day. And the city also made a lot of commitments towards sustainability. We have the Green and Healthy Street Declaration, and towards zero emission buses. We also have the Climate Action and Sustainable Development Plan, which was launched this year, and all the objectives and goals and actions of the government is towards this plan. This plan guides all the actions that we have inside the city government. And also we have a low emission zone to propose in downtown that is already starting the studies for that. But so although we have all these commitments, we also face a very serious crisis in public transport. So we have a drop in the demand. It was, of course, the pandemic worsened it, but then we didn't have the demand that we had before, and it affects not only it affects the service, it affects the way we contract until now, and that's why we need to remodulate all these kind of things, because we cannot make innovation in a crisis. So in a crisis, we have to solve, and then we need to organize our home to make to make improvements. And so that's the point that we have today. So the current model today is completely based on the operators. All the operators, they act, they organize, they manage all the functions of the public transport, and it's very bad for the city, because the city don't have the ability and public accountability and public transparency to make the improvements. So we know that that we have a crisis, but today we didn't have the instruments to make it. So that's why we are in the movement of every piece of public transport system. We have a specialized operator, a specialized actor, and with a different kind of contract of relation and contract to make it work in a separate way, and each operator really be specialized on what's its specialization. So we are talking about fare collection separated from the operators. We are talking about terminal stations and BRT systems. So where we were talking about how we could improve the e-buses. And also, so one thing that we also figured out inside, that we didn't have many specialties in the city to talk about electric infrastructure and business models. So ITDP also supports us with that. So how we could make this modeling, and Maria Fernanda Ortiz help us. So we are also dealing with Cipopolis to see which routes could be more adapted to no-emission free buses, and also to see the sizing and depot. We know that it's a great constraint, and we need to cope with different kind of factors to promote electrical infrastructure, and also financing. So there is also support from TUMI, WRI, and C40 for manufacturers, review of vehicles, and all the pieces that we need to know to make a better model. So from the technical point of view, I believe that we could join all the pieces that we need to know to promote, to make a good plan. So we also have a pilot project. It was we call Green Summer. It was a bus that was provided by Enel here in Rio de Janeiro, and it goes through cultural points in Madureira, where it's a place of samba. It was a very interesting project. And now we are working on the analysis with drivers and users to see what was the service indicators and what we need to monitor to see how it works. So we are in this phase of study this data. So now, as I said before, that we plan all this stuff, we have the support of our legislative level to allow us to make all these changes. So it's not only a technical point, but also institutional changes that must be done, and we have some support on that. So we are, as we have said, separated each piece of public transport. So we have now a bid for the new public system, which will allow us to have transparency and autonomy, even if we need to subsidize some service. So we need the ticketing system to do that. And also, we are in the bid for, today we have a bid open for the bus provision, and we are preparing the bid for beer system operation, and we split. So that's why I'm going to explain I'm going to explain right now. So when we analyze different bidding models, we see that it was important that we have different operators for the system operation and the fleet provision. So that's one thing that we see, and we need to see how we could cope in our administrative and legal scheme that we have. But we understand that it was very important to have these one splits. And when we start to analyze each model, the chosen one that we would like to implement was the joint one, that we have a joint provision, a joint between provider and operator. So it mitigates risks. So each one make a bid with the operators and the vehicles they are used to, or they. We understand that this could be a very good model. Also, we see that we could make 2 bids, but then open the envelopes in the same day, but it could not match in the end, so we didn't go on this. And the other one that was the sequential. The Santiago model, that we have a bid for providers and then a bid for operators in the separate time scheme. But then when we saw the institutional barriers that we couldn't do the chosen one. So it was not legally possible for the city to have these 2 joint procurement together. So we have to split that. And also, we didn't have financial guarantee. So when we saw other schemes, we could see that for bus operators, we could have a concession. So it's more a long-term contract. We have a more financial guarantees. But then when we talk about bus acquisition, so it's the same way to buy a pen and to buy a bus. And we know that's not the same way, but we couldn't fit it in a concession. It could be an acquisition with a very limited period of contract, and it couldn't work for us. So that's why we need this second model couldn't work, and then we decided to purchase buses to make the separated operators and the providers. But as I said, as we are facing a very huge crisis, we couldn't, and we also understand all the difficulties that we have implementing electric infrastructure. We couldn't do it right now. So that's why we decided to go on diesel buses to stop the crisis, to make to have new buses here, to have service, and then we start the transition towards low emission buses. So we have the challenge that we face, of course. So we took a lot of time on business model, because in the city, in the Brazilian institutional scheme, it's very difficult to have this innovative business model. And of course, when we talk about e-buses, we're talking about energy provider also, and we need to cope with that. So it was not so simple. And we also have in the studies that we have, we could understand the general pieces of the technical aspects, but also we need to include some operational costs that we are working on that. And then also the thing about the depots. So we need to adapt the depots, and we see it's a very high limitation. So it's not only where they are, or if it's even if consider if it's public, because we don't have many public land available. And so when I say that, so each operator to make this arrangement. So that's why we didn't. It's so important that the city really manage and coordinate all the pieces. Otherwise, we wouldn't have innovation. So we saw the the phases that we have for the adaptation of the depots, and also the lack of expertise that we had inside the city, because it's a process that the city is moving on, and we did have technical, in case of DRT, that we articulated electric vehicles. So it will not be so good for us to make a competition for just one winner. So that's one point. So we need to improve the national market for that. And also, so for the e-buses, we are not talking about only the depots or the vehicle, the charging and things, but we are talking about the energy energy provider. So it's another actor that we need to engage and coordinate on this scheme. So the lessons learned. So it's important to increase the electric bus competitiveness, and also this political and legal constraints. So we are the legal procedures, and we still face a lot of barriers to make innovative business models. Of course, the guarantee is something that the providers and the ones, and is something that the city must see how it copes, but it's a problem. And also the infrastructure, depot infrastructure, it's something that we need to, something that we cannot understand, that we are going to have 200 and 300 e-buses at the same time. So we need to make it step by step. And in this transition, something that we need to see how we are going to improve. For we have each time more fleets. And for what we need to be done. So this alternative business model is very important, and something about contracting. So we cannot cope with an operator that have 20 years of contract. So any innovation, anything is going to be done by that. So we need to have shorter contracts so we can include these innovations along the service, along the lifetime of the city. So it cannot be like that. Mapping the best routes is also very interesting today, very restricted. We cannot even use the best routes to that. So that's important that we map it, but also that our contracts allow innovation along the way. And also the adaptation of depots is something that we need to strengthen the relation with the local distribution of energy. And that's it.
Thank you, Simone. I'm going to share the screen for Marcel. I hope that's working well.
Yes, thank you, Ana. Well, hi everyone. My name is Marcel Gomez, and I'm the electromobility leader at Metrobus in Mexico City. So today I'll be sharing with you some of the experiences, challenges, and lessons learned so far from our first steps in this route to electromobility. So let's start by answering the question of that you all might be wondering, what is Metrobus? And well, Metrobus is Mexico City's BRT, or Bus Rapid Transit public transportation system. Next, please. And it makes part of what we now call Mexico City Integrated Mobility. So this is a plan from the actual Mexico City government to integrate, as its name says, all previously existing public transportation systems in just one massive system. This is accessible for everyone, and this comprises the Mexico City Metro, the Metrobus system, and some other systems as the trolleybuses or eco bikes. Next. Well, Metrobus system first started operations in 2005, and since then it has grown to have 7 operating lines. These are operated by 16 different companies, to which we concession the operation of our service. And some facts about Metrobus is that we have an extension of 164 route extension. And just before the start of the pandemic, we were moving about 1.7 million passengers on an average weekday. Metrobus bus fleet consists on 786 buses, most of which are articulated and bi-articulated buses or double articulated. We also have double deckers, 12 and 15-meter buses. And just recently, we started integrating the first fleet of electric buses, which are electric articulated buses. And now I'm going to talk about the electromobility projects for Metrobus. So our road towards electromobility began in 2020, when we started to structure a 10-year plan to replace our fleet with electric buses. This plan came initially from Mexico City government, which recently seeks to promote clean and sustainable public transportation systems. And so the plan begins with a pilot phase to learn about the system's capabilities to migrate to electric buses, and then the progressive replacement of diesel buses with electric buses at the end of their 10-year lifetime. Next, please. In the pilot phase, the pilot phase started in August 2020 with the arrival of our first electric bus, and 1 year later, in August 2021, with the arrival of 9 buses. At the same time, during this period, some test buses were incorporated for a period of 3 months. And now, in 2022, we are in the first project of the renewal plan, which consists of the implementation of 60 electric buses by the end of this year. And then we will continue to replace the fleet towards 2030, where we expect to have 100% of our system to be electric. Next, please. So during our pilot phase, the work was focused mainly on the design of the technical specifications of the electric buses, since we have to ensure that electric buses to be purchased meet the same operating capacity as the diesel buses. Electromobility projects tend to require different operation schemes and business models. So we had to look for technical and economically viable alternatives to develop them. And also the cost of acquisition for electric buses is much higher than the cost for diesel buses. So different mechanisms were also explored to meet the higher cost of the initial investment. A fundamental step in this development of the pilot phase was to develop relationships with our stakeholders. Different international organizations started joining this project and have since provided technical support for its development. Working together with these organizations has provided Metrobus with technical advice for electromobility projects, and has also been of vital importance for the development of the whole project. In turn, we were also able to gain attention from different technology providers for both the buses and the energy infrastructure. And as we move forward in these projects, we are looking to add more and more stakeholders. Some of the challenges so far we have been facing had to do mainly with the charging infrastructure, as this is equivalent to the field for the diesel buses. Poorly designed charging infrastructure results in inefficiencies in charging the buses, and therefore not being able to operate as planned. So good long-term project planning is necessary so that the charging infrastructure is capable of charging the buses throughout the whole life of the project. Structuring a renewal plan such as that of Metrobus in 10 years implies complying with the fleet renewal and the adaptation of recharging infrastructure on very specific dates. So complying with the projects on time implies a major challenge. Another challenge has been finding an adequate financing for the project, because the initial investments, as I said before, are much higher than for diesel buses. And this has led us to rethink our business models, as diesel bus-based models do not work in the same way. Also, the search for new business models has also led us to have multiple negotiations with our operating companies who had to be open up to this transition as well. And electric buses, finally, are not chosen from a catalog, but they have to be designed according to the technical requirements of the routes where they will operate. So a correct selection of the batteries and the charging schemes is necessary to guarantee a good autonomy and therefore a good operation of the system. From this pilot phase, some of the results we have found so far is that we have a saving of about 75% in fuel costs. Also, the maintenance costs are reduced by about 30%. And even though the initial investment cost is much higher for electric buses than for diesel buses, our TCO, or total cost of operation analysis, show that in the long term, electric buses have savings of about 33% over diesel buses. And there's a decreasing trend in the cost of electric vehicle technology, so we believe that savings will be even greater in the future. So finally, here are some of the lessons learned so far for our project. So first, say that electromobility is not an exclusive model for small and wealthy cities. We have seen and learned from the case of cities such as Santiago or Bogota, where are large Latin American cities that have begun this transition and today are leading cities in electromobility. And so is now Mexico City starting this transition to electromobility. And many of the challenges we are facing now are faced by almost all cities. So it's not an exclusive model. Also, long-term planning is essential, as I explained before, for a good project. The correct selection of batteries, operation and charging schemes, defining a business model, charging infrastructure, and having sufficient time for planning is essential for the project to last in the long term. These projects are not just for 5 or 10 years as conventional diesel bus models, but electric buses are thought to be operating for 15 or 20 years. So long-term planning is essential. Also, the role of the local governments is essential for the development, but it's not only necessary to promote and encourage clean and sustainable public transportation projects, but also it's necessary to have technical expertise to know what such projects entail and require. And in this way, more facilities can be provided by the government to help implement electromobility projects. The integration of all parts involved is essential, from the government, as I explained, and the operating companies, international organizations, and also technology providers is fundamental to achieve a good cohesion and obtain better results. And finally, be open to change, because transition from diesel based model to electric buses will imply and will require big changes in the operation and the design of conventional models. So you need to be open to change and transition for the electric buses. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. So we may actually have a little bit less time for the panel discussion, so I'll ask Stan to be very strategic in choosing the questions for us. And the same with Q&A, we may actually need to follow up with everyone through an email with some answered questions, but apologies for that. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Ivona. I see that there's a lot of excitement within the Q&A, but also there's a lot of information that we just provided you also. It was really interesting to hear Simone and Marcelo's perspective, specifically around these specific crises, depending on where you are, and obviously opportunities and kind of the challenges that Metrobus has experienced in terms of the implementation. But I really want to kind of broaden this kind of really quickly, because I think, Marcelo, you highlighted it in one of your recommendations, is that I guess, can you tell us how, and I'm addressing this to both of you, how the national policies support that shift towards electrification in from that local context, and specifically what can local governments do to help either embrace or help make that cohesion occur around those national policies. So yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Rio or from this perspective of Metrobus, I'd be very interested to hear more about that.
Sure, Stan. Well, what local governments can do, as I explained, they play a fundamental role in this transition, not just because they need to incentive and promote these kind of projects, but also they need, as I was saying before, to gain technical expertise in these projects. So they have to know what they are doing. So it's not enough just to promote these projects, but also to know what they require and what they imply, because that way the governments can involve better and provide more support and advice to accompany these projects. So in the case of Metrobus, as I first said in my presentation, this project, this 10-year project, was promoted by the Mexico City government. But one of the challenges that we have so far is that the agenda is already structured, and there was no previous knowledge and expertise on this. So now we need to deal and to come up with these projects. At the same time, we gain this expertise and we develop this project. So there's no time there has not been time for us to learn so much about this. We need to learn at the same time we're doing it. So that's a challenge that could be avoided if the government were more involved in this and had provided more technical expertise.
Interesting.
So in the Brazilian case, yeah. So the federal levels also provide some service. They make the acquisition of vehicles. They have a fleet for different ministers. Yeah, so maybe it could be important that they start to improve that towards low emission buses, because we could stimulate a local market, and then it could be easier for the cities to join these activities, this strategy also. And from the local government, so it's important that we see that the term, the period of contract is something very critical, and we need to make it smaller, not so long, because we cannot cope with innovation if the contracts are too long. So that's one thing that we learn in all this process. So when we have a contract that it's already there and it's a long term, so it's difficult to make innovations and to see all along the way. So it's important that we reframe it in the new bids that we are promoting.
No, I think you just highlighted again that flexibility is crucial, right? Being able to kind of address and respond and be flexible to the kind of the newness and the I guess the nascent adoption of e-buses. It's going to require a bit of a learning curve, as Marcelo, as you just highlighted, in terms of building that technical assistance. But as well as being, again, flexible enough to kind of move from different ideas and pivot when necessary. So we have a lot of questions from the Q&A, and I don't know where to start. So I'm just going to start to, I guess, go through the list, and maybe there's a couple directed towards, I believe, each of you. But I'll start with, I believe, Marcel. There is the question, I believe, around what would you mind telling me about the software you use to draw the map of your city? I guess if someone's very interested in that. I think, Marcel, yeah, maybe if you can answer that. But then for Simone, I guess with the periodic droughts in Brazil, caused, I think, disturbances in the stability of the electric supply. I guess from the standpoint of what you've been able to kind of identify in your pilot, is there a reliance on different types of bus technologies as you kind of consider more than maybe battery electric buses? I believe there was something around fuel cells and hydrogen power. So I'll see if I can get some answers from both of you now.
Yes, well, we have no any specific software for planning. With the technical assistance that we have from our international organizations, they have provided these results and these data from their simulations, but we as Metrobus don't have any specific software. So all the information that we have now for planning has been given to us.
So in our case, so it's important that we test different technologies. So this summer, spring summer, it was a bit that we opened, and for low emission vehicles, and just one of e-buses that came to test in the pilots that we made. So it's important that the manufacturers also come and try to test and see what happens in the city also. So we are open to different technologies, but we need to test them here.
Sure. I guess I'll just ask one more follow-up question. So I think one of the things that, as we maybe mentioned, that it's important that the business model and the financial kind of financial and funding components kind of line up. We have a question here about how can you kind of raise capital capacity for bus owners and operators if potentially the government can't provide the direct incentives or supports. Do you guys have any specific examples as you guys think about the implementation of electric buses there and how that kind of comes together?
Well, in the case of Metrobus, one strategy that we have taken so far for the initial inversion cost of the fleet is to split the cost into different parts. So the risk is also separated in different parts. So that's one of the strategies we have taken so far, and we will prove in the near future if that results or not. As I said, we are just starting to take these first steps. So most of the decisions we are taking so far will be proven to be right or wrong in the future. But we have technical expertise, advisory from international organizations enough to be pretty sure that what we are doing is going to result well. So yeah, our strategy has been to split inversion cost into different parts.
So in the case of Rio, it's important, I think I more or less explain. So the city is wants to improve that and reduce this kind of cost. So about the public depots, it's something that we know how important it is. And so in the first, that what we are studying in the beginning, the new operator must do the improvements in the electric infrastructure, but then we are also seeing what the city could do about it. So we are, as we study each pieces, we are seeing which the public administration can do to reduce this kind of risks.
Great. All right, so I think we're coming close to time, and I want to kind of ask one final question as a kind of closing remark for each of you to kind of answer. And what I think, again, we've really kind of covered quite a bit, but what is the key lesson from this process, I guess, in the facilitation and the implementation of, electric buses into your fleet that you want to share with other cities and with other listeners on this webinar? What would be the one takeaway that you would highlight or stress within that? And we'll start with Simone.
I think we have a lot of information, technical information, so it's good. When I started in these studies 4 years ago, it was not so many information available. Now it's okay, but then we have to fit with our institutional scheme. In each city, in each country has a different way of contracting. So what works for Chile and Colombia doesn't work for Brazil because we have a new legal framework. So that's what we are doing right now. Engineers and architects go deep in the legal process to see how we can cope with that.
Excellent. Marcel?
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, the most important lesson is that, well, as I also said in my presentation, this is not an exclusive model for small cities. So this can be achieved by any city. Any city has different conditions, factors that affect differently the project. So as Simona said, the case of some Latin American cities will not be the same for Mexico City or for Brazil. But I think we all can handle this transition. At the end, I think it's necessary because if you ask me, I would say that the future of electromobility relies on public transportation, and also the future of public transportation is electric. So we better start moving now towards this transition and don't hesitate to speed these projects. Give enough time to plan, settle everything, because once you start structuring the project, you will realize there are a lot of challenges and factors that you were not taking into consideration initially. So give enough time for planning.
I think that that's a great pep talk to kind of close this out. And I really appreciate both of you all providing that rich and unique context from Rio and Mexico. So very excited to kind of really dive into, we got a lot of questions, and so I'm sure that we'll be following up with you and trying to answer those, but really appreciate you guys again sharing your experiences and being frank about the opportunities and considerations for eBus implementation. So with that, I will turn it over to Ivona.
Great, thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of the session. Indeed, this was a really great discussion. I shared in the chat a link to the next webinar on April 20th, and we'll also offer a part 2 webinar on e-buses in late May, so stay tuned. So really, I encourage everyone to visit ITDP's website and social media to check for latest releases and upcoming events. And again, I wanted to thank you so much to today's moderator, panelists, as well as our attendees for joining this webinar. So with that, I really thank you everyone again and see you soon. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.